Hi, welcome to the screencast, or the first of what will probably be two or three on the digestive system. We've already gone over this general anatomy here, so we're just going to dive right in. We're going to start with a little bit of background and how things are controlled, and then pretty much just take a tour through the digestive tract from one end to the other. And we'll keep it as brief as possible. So the first thing that you want to know is that your digestive tract can sense what's going on inside of it. Right? So you've got stretch receptors and then chemoreceptors that track changes in things like osmolarity and pH, or the number of, let's say, amino acids that are in the stomach, so that your GI tract knows where food is and, to a certain extent, the degree of digestion that's taken place. So I'm going to talk briefly about regulatory mechanisms while this slide here is up. So that first one was called intrinsic mechanisms, which is what's shown here. And if you go back to the text, there are two intrinsic controls or regulatory mechanisms. The first is right here, these short reflexes. So you have a number of neurons or nerves that run throughout your gastrointestinal tract called the enteric nerve plexus, or the enteric nervous system, and that just helps one part of your GI tract coordinate with another. So, let's say your large intestine empties out. That will then be coordinated with your small intestine, so that as the large intestine empties, the small intestine is dumping new stuff into the large intestine so that everything moves along in a coordinated fashion. You also have a number of hormones that just circulate in your peritoneal cavity or in your abdomen that help coordinate activity in one part of the digestive tract versus another. Then you have extrinsic controls. Extrinsic just means things that are outside of the digestive tract, or includes things outside of the digestive tract. So the first extrinsic mechanism on that last slide refers to long reflexes, and this is just the gut communicating with the brain and then the brain responding in some way. You don't need to know any specific long reflexes. And then you should also just know that your sympathetic nervous system and parasympathetic nervous system also affect GI tract activity, with sympathetic nervous system decreasing your GI tract activity and parasympathetic increasing the GI tract activity. So in lab, we did a little bit of histology on the digestive tract. In lecture, we reinforce it with descriptions of the different tissue layers that you find in the GI tract. So you are not going to see this picture on the next exam, but you should be able to answer questions about which tissue types show up in the different layers. And I'm just going to keep this picture up as I talk about the next couple of slides here, so that I have something to refer to. So you can refer to the slides as I go through. So the first layer that we care about is this one right here. This is called the mucosa. So there are two things that you want to know about the mucosa. You want to know it's the inner layer, which means it lines the lumen. And then it's a mucous membrane, and so as a mucous membrane, it has three layers to it. It has an epithelium, a lamina propria, and then a muscularis mucosae. And this layer right here, you can't generally see under the microscope on our slides, but it's there to move the mucus around inside of the GI tract. Then the next layer out, which is this layer right here, is called the submucosa. You want to know this is made out of areolar connective tissue, which we looked at in AP1. And this is where you find additional glands, blood vessels, and nervous tissue as well. And then the next layer out is the muscularis externa, which is made up of two layers. The inner layer here is the circular muscle, and then the outer layer here is the longitudinal muscle. This is the layer that's responsible for moving stuff throughout your digestive tract, mixing food within your digestive tract, and it's what forms sphincters like the ileocecal valve or the pylorus. So there are two terms that you want to be aware of regarding how the muscularis externa works. The first is peristalsis, and you just want to know that this is how food is moved in linear fashion throughout your digestive tract. You don't have to be able to describe or know specifically this definition here because it's a little bit confusing, but just know that the two layers of your muscularis externa, the circular and the longitudinal muscle, work together to perform what is called peristalsis, and that is how food or feces is moved through your GI tract. Then the next term is called segmentation. This is how food is mixed as it moves through your GI tract. This takes place primarily in the stomach and the small intestine. So if you just look here, you're going to squeeze here and you're going to squeeze here. So this bit of food is going to mix with that bit of food here. And then the opposite happens. You squeeze here and you squeeze here. And this mixes with that. So you get continual mixing, pushing stuff forward and back so that everything you eat get mixed together well. And it gets mixed with mucus and enzymes and bile and everything that helps with digestion. Then I'm going to go back one slide and point out that you have one more layer on the very outside of your GI tract. This is the peritoneum. This is the serous membrane that covers your abdominal cavity. So if you look here, we'll go over the two layers of it. Excuse me. Lining the outside of your abdominal organs like stomach, large intestine, or small intestine is the visceral peritoneum. And then lining both the posterior and anterior wall of your abdominal cavity is the parietal peritoneum. Then there are two more terms associated with the peritoneum that you want to know. The first is the mesenteries, and as the next slide says, that is just the double layer of the peritoneum that your organs are actually suspended in. Now I'm going to go back a couple of slides and show you this one again. Right, so your peritoneum comes off your abdominal wall, wraps all the way around your intestine, and then doubles back on itself. And this is the route through which blood vessels, lymphatic capillaries, and nerves run. So you have this peritoneum that lines your abdominal cavity. Some organs that are within the cavity line behind this peritoneum. That is called retroperitoneal, which just means it's in the abdominal cavity, but it's behind the peritoneum. There are two organs that we're going to cover, actually three, that are retroperitoneal. The kidneys are behind it, the pancreas, and the duodenum as well, that first loop of the small intestine, all are located behind the peritoneum. All right, then we get to blood supply. So these arteries up here, you don't have to worry about. We covered those when we did the blood vessels in lab. What's more important is the hepatic portal circulation, because this we did not talk about. And I'm just going to go down to the next slide so you can see it. There are a number of veins that we didn't cover in lab. You might remember that we didn't cover the splenic vein or the gastric vein or any mesenteric veins. These are all the veins that drain your digestive tract. So gastric vein draining the blood that comes from your stomach, mesenteric veins draining all of the blood from your intestines, both large and small, and then the splenic vein draining the spleen. So instead of the blood from these organs going into the regular systemic circulation, it needs to be processed or filtered, however you want to think about it. So before being dumped into the inferior vena cava, this blood goes through the liver. So all of those veins formed what is called the hepatic portal vein. and that then dumps the blood into the liver, where it'll enter the capillary beds in the liver. And then the liver will do its processing of the blood, dealing with nutrients, regulating cholesterol levels, and helping the spleen recycle things like hemoglobin and bile. Next up then is the salivary glands. I really don't care very much about the salivary glands. So you want to know that you have 3 of them, and these are the names of the salivary glands. You will not have to identify them. There might be one question on the exam, which of the following is not a salivary gland? You do want to know just the basics about what is in saliva. It is mostly water. It's also going to have some electrolytes, big deal. You do want to remember that it has some amylase and some lipase. Hopefully, if you see something that ends in ASE, you know that means it is an enzyme. Yes, you're thinking enzyme right now. So these are both enzymes. Amylase digests amylose, which, like glucose, is a sugar. It's actually a polysaccharide, so it's more of a starch. But salivary amylase is going to start digesting chemically or enzymatically starches as they're in your mouth, and lipase is an enzyme that digests lipids, hence lipase. So chemical or enzymatic digestion of those 2 macromolecules is going to start as you're chewing. Then there's also a little bit of lysozyme, which is just an antibacterial enzyme, and defensins, which are antibacterial proteins and antibodies. So this is all to help kill the bacteria in the food that you might be eating. So the esophagus we're going to skip over. We're assuming now that you have eaten some food, you've chewed it, you've swallowed it. Neither of those to me are very interesting processes. So now we're down in the stomach, and we're going to start by just talking about briefly the anatomy of the stomach. Let's see, what do we want to know? Let me go back here. There's only really one important thing I want you to know about the anatomy of the stomach, and that is that it has 3 muscular layers. So before we said there was a circular layer and a longitudinal layer to your digestive tract. The stomach is the exception to that. It's got a longitudinal layer, a circular layer, and an oblique layer. That 3rd layer just makes it more efficient at mushing food back and forth and physically breaking down the food. Your stomach is basically a little sack of acid that mushes and munches the food and breaks it down physically, but doesn't do a lot of chemical or enzymatic digestion of the food. We are going to stop this screencast here because 15 minutes is the max I want to do on these. So we'll pick up in the next screencast with the gastric pits and the cells that you find inside your stomach.